In my later teens, I was more interested in playing baseball than researching family history or even pursuing the Dr. King story. I attended East Northumberland Secondary School in Brighton from the fall of 1965 to the spring of 1970, back in the days when it took 5 years to finish high school. My favorite subject in high school was always history, but I had the most fun in Latin class. Yes, I was one of the geeks who took Latin from grade 10 to 13. Part of the reason for that was my teacher, Dennis Buckley, who always made it fun. As my grade 13 yearbook says, I was the only boy in a class of 5 in grade 13 Latin. In our small Latin classes, we had a wonderful time dealing with Latin literature, poetry, and Roman history. Another idea that was strongly present for me was my love of National Geographic magazine. As a kid, I often raced from the school bus to the post office on the day I was sure the next issue would arrive. Neighbors were used to walking around the young Buchanan boy who could not wait to get home and sat on the stoop of the post office checking out the latest stories of faraway lands and the people who lived there. I was particularly interested in seeing what map might be in the magazine this time. I was a big fan, to say the least. So it's fair to say that at age 20, I was more interested in learning about the wider world than my own family history. That was demonstrated by the fact that I spent 3 months hitchhiking around Europe in the fall of 1970. A friend of my sister's boyfriend was looking for a traveling companion, and I had little interest in going directly to university at that time, so this was a welcome challenge and diversion. Most of the pictures my traveling companion took during the trip were of old buildings and Roman ruins, but he did get one of this geeky teenage tourist at the Italian town of Portofino. Yes, the Canadian flag on the jacket was a requirement. It got you rides in those days. One of my favorite souvenirs from the trip is this European tourist license plate from our car. My traveling companion was able to buy a very cheap old Peugeot when we were staying with friends at Lahr, Germany, early in the trip. My companion's father was Air Force, and we were able to take advantage of close connections between folks from the base at Trenton and those stationed at this time in the base at Lahr. In fact, the FLQ crisis began while we were there. Needless to say, there were a lot of anxious military folks around Lahr for a few days. In any case, our trip continued. We drove that old car through Belgium, the Netherlands, Denmark, and back down south through Germany and France to the Riviera. In Italy, I started to utilize my Latin, much to the amusement of my traveling companion. In Rome, we stayed for 2 full weeks, and we hit all the museums and historic sites. I tried to translate every Latin inscription I found on the ruins I encountered in this historic city. It was great fun, at least for me. Then we decided to split up. My companion crossed the Adriatic Sea and drove the car up through Yugoslavia. In contrast, I continued the Roman ruin theme by hitchhiking up the east side of Italy, which was a bit scary, but an amazing experience. We arranged to meet up again at Venice, and after a few days we headed for Munich through the Alps. Unfortunately, the engine of the old Peugeot had other ideas. After belching black smoke for a time, the engine finally seized up. That left us on the side of the road late in the evening, surrounded by mountains with snow falling. We removed the license plates and hitched our way to Innsbruck, and eventually made it to Munich. We were home for Christmas. It was clear to everyone that the trip to Europe was transformational for me. I came back a much more confident young person. On returning home from traveling, I attended the University of Western Ontario at London, Ontario. I entered university after having written a journal of my travels, and it's fair to say that I was indulging the fantasy of being a journalist, in particular a writer for National Geographic, my favorite magazine. First year was mostly general social science studies, and totally uninteresting, except for history class. In second year, I began with a major in journalism. However, a month into my second year, my naive ideas about journalism were made evident. So I transferred to honors history, just long enough to buy all the books. Soon I determined that the subject of study was not the issue. I had to face the fact that I was feeling very distressed in a way that I had never experienced before. I had the strong feeling that I was not in the right place and that it was potentially dangerous to stay there. One reason for this was the overwhelming presence of drugs and booze in the student residence where I lived, and more generally in the student community. Another was that I felt in my gut that I needed to be productive in a much more tangible way. I could blame growing up on the farm for that. But it was hard to combat that old idea that the smart kids were always destined for university. I had completely bought into that. Finally, I was ready to admit that I was totally sick of school. I was only briefly at home for Christmas that year and quickly came back to the townhouse in London that I shared with 3 other students. Nobody else was there, so I had some much needed alone time. During this time, I saw an ad in the newspaper for an entry-level technical support position with suite of cash registers. It is hard to explain why, but I immediately identified with that ad. I cut it out of the paper and stared at it for an hour. I became convinced that this was the perfect job for me. As a result, I pursued it for 3 months, to the exclusion of every other opportunity. As it turned out, I did well in the tests and interviews, and was given the job in Kitchener. Later, my boss told me that my experience growing up on the farm gave me the perfect skill set for this kind of work. He cited the basic work ethic as being most important, but also the direct experience with tools and machinery. The work was very challenging, but I enjoyed it immensely. In fact, it was the perfect job for me at that time. The 1980s was what you might call my motorcycle period. My company car was an American Motors Pacer, so I needed something to support my desire to travel for enjoyment. I started small and quickly graduated to a Honda 550, which I outfitted with bags, bucket, and shield for long-distance travel. Over a couple of years in the middle of the 1980s, I traveled coast to coast in Canada and as far south as North Carolina in the U.S. Looking back on it, I have to say that I was very lucky to survive all that motorcycle riding. When my aunt routinely told me to be careful, I told her that I was so careful sometimes it wasn't even fun. However, after a decade or so, I developed more interest in personal safety and creature comforts, so eventually the bike fell out of favor and was sold. Through the 1980s, I also visited my grandparents in Codrington on a more or less regular basis. That is, Lloyd and Louise Ames, who lived in this neat house on the west side of number 30 highway in the village. Sometimes I would help Grandfather build or fix something in his workshop beside the house. Otherwise, we would sit in his living room and gab. Eventually, I became interested in some pictures he showed me regarding King and Ames family gatherings. We worked a lot on this picture, which shows a King Ames family gathering in 1910 at Codrington. The little guy sitting in the front row, second from the left end, was Lloyd Ames. Sitting to his left was Bill Goodfellow, his best friend and a cousin. Right behind them is David Nelson King, who was a younger brother of William Henry King. In the back row, second from the left, is Linnie King Ames, and to her left is her husband, Walter Ames. These two were the parents of Lloyd Ames. It would be fair to say that Lloyd Ames was not great with details like dates and names. However, he had lots of stories about people, which were instructive in different ways. Over time, with information from his stories and some research of my own, I was able to piece together the details which allowed me to put names to every one of these faces. It was really during our work on this picture that I began to understand the direct connection between me and my family and the notorious murderer. In a more general sense, it also served to elevate the idea of family history a bit higher into my consciousness. Of course, this talk about family history could not avoid questions about the Dr. King story. Grandfather was very reluctant to talk about it. He maintained that regime of silence we experienced while growing up on the farm in the 1950s and 60s. In particular, I pressed him on the sequence of events regarding the memorial of Dr. King, where I knew he had some personal experience. His response to this part of the story was very emotional. For him, this topic represented his mother, who he loved dearly. He recalled the distress she felt at the presence of the memorial beside the house. However, he eventually succumbed to my persistent prodding and provided me with the story of the memorial given earlier in part 1 of this video series. Lloyd Ames turned 90 years of age in the fall of 1992, and a 90th birthday party was held for him at the Codrington Community Center. He was starting to feel a bit tough by this time, but he appreciated seeing everybody, especially the grandchildren. That's me behind him, my brother Lloyd to my left, and sisters Ruth Ann and Mary Lou sitting on either side of the guest of honor. Lloyd Ames passed away in March of the next year.